last Sunday, Pam and I worshiped at, and Josh, our son, worshiped at the South Fayette Church of Christ in Fayetteville, Georgia. And if that sounds familiar to you, that's where our brother Chris Sanders moved. And so greetings from the Sanders family. They're all doing well, and we miss them, and I think they miss a lot of us as well. But it was good to see them. The congregation there is doing very well. The work is going really well with Chris, and so we're grateful for that. Obviously, you knew I was teaching, or several knew I was teaching today because we got a lot of holes in the auditorium. And I don't blame you for those that are not here. I don't blame them for that. But thank you, Rod. Thank you. I know we have some folks out for spring break with their kids, and we wish them safe travels. So we're really going to back up this week. Last week I asked Jeff, and they had taught this class the previous quarter. I asked Jeff if he could just cover chapter 1. I had already worked on quite a bit of the first lesson, which was going to be more of a background on the book of Thessalonians and more of a background on the church at Thessalonica and the city of Thessalonica. And so he did that, and I appreciate that. So we'll actually step back this week and talk about that. Then next week we will get back into the text itself. We will be covering part of Acts 17 today, which is the text that talks about the establishment of the church in Thessalonica. I appreciate Scott Beyer. He recommended a book, and this might be of value to you all. It's by J.W. McGarvey. It's called Thessalonians, Corinthians, Galatians, and Romans. And I found it to be a very useful book in this study. So if you're interested, of course, you can get that on Amazon.com. Oops. Whoa. So one of the things that's interesting for me about this study is that in my business travels, the city of Thessalonica is one place that I've actually been. I've been there a couple of times on business. So it's kind of interesting for me to talk about Thessalonica. Let's see if I can master this. So this is going to be kind of how we plan to attack the rest of the quarter. Today we're covering background, and there are only 9 total chapters, I believe, in 8, I guess, in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. So it's a relatively short study in terms of the mass of material. One of my concerns when I let Scott talk me into this was that we were going to run out of material. So in another 11, 12 weeks, are we going to have enough material to stretch out to that period of time? So what that means is, if you get tired of hearing me talk, you better be talking. So you better be participating, I hope. If you were here on Wednesday night and Grant was teaching started teaching Philippians, he talked about going to the concert, and they have the headliner, but then they have the warm-up acts, and I don't even consider myself a warm-up act, so look for all the help you can give me as we go through this study. Okay. Any questions or comments before we move on? All right. So let's talk about the city of Thessalonica and the surrounding area during New Testament times, and actually before New Testament times. So it was founded by Cassander of Macedon, as you see in 315 BC, and he named it for his wife. I guess we would pronounce that today Thessaloniki, and she was the daughter of Philip of Macedon, sister of Alexander the Great. One of the interesting things that happened for me when on my first trip to Thessalonica, or as the Greeks today would call it Thessaloniki, or Soloniki, was that we were traveling down to visit an area, and our host said, "Oh, let's just stop here for a few minutes." And so we stopped, and it turned out to be an area called Pella, and Pella was basically where Philip of Macedon's palace was built, and where Alexander the Great was born. It looks like a wide spot in the road now. They were building housing there. They were digging foundations, and they ran into ruins. And so it was kind of interesting to think you're standing somewhere where Alexander the Great was born, and where some of the great Greek characters came from that area. But anyway, it was a very important city. It's a city that we know only because of the book of Thessalonians, or most of us. But it was a very important city in its time, and it's still an important city today. It was the capital of the second Roman district of Macedonia. A lot of wealth, a city of learning, a seaport, and so it was strategically placed. It had, at that time, it had a population of about 100,000. And if you think back in those days, a city of 100,000 would be pretty significant. And I was reading where in about the 1400s, the city actually exceeded the population of London. So we think about, okay, it's this Greek city, yeah, it's important, it's in the Bible, blah, 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 but actually it was very important city. It was a city that was a melting pot, as you might imagine at this time. You had Greeks, of course, you had Roman colonists, and you had the Jewish religion. There was at least one synagogue in the city. And if you think about that, in a city of 100,000 and one synagogue, there may not have been all that many Jews there, but it was a melting pot. And so that presented a lot of challenges as we think about Paul teaching there, because he was teaching to just to really a mixture of cultures and a mixture of people. This is a picture of modern day Thessalonica, or part of it. You can see the Aegean Sea there, and it's a large spread out city. I actually took this picture from my hotel balcony. You can see the seaport, and I can remember standing there looking at this, thinking, "Wow, a couple thousand years ago, Paul was here." I don't know exactly where he was, but he was here. And for those of you that have been to Israel, Palestine, that area, and I know some of you have, and I can't imagine how that feels, but it's a pretty neat feeling when you realize you're standing where some of the greats have stood. It is today the second largest city in Greece, second to Athens. Athens has a population of about 3.5 million. But the metropolitan area of Thessaloniki, or Soloniki, is about 1 million. It continues to be an important hub for the country of Greece, economy, industry, commercial, political. It is a very important area. Prior to 1900, over 50% of the population there was Jewish. Now they estimate today less than 1%. We are studying Philippians on Wednesday nights. I did a little research to see what's the story on Philippi today? And the population of Philippi today is somewhere around maybe 20,000. So quite a difference between Philippi and Thessalonica, or Thessaloniki. So I know this slide is a bit challenging to read, but I did want to include it. I talked about one of the challenges that Paul, Silas, Timothy would have in teaching in this area. Go back to your world history, maybe in middle school or high school. What was an important landmark to the Greeks? Anybody? I'll give you a hint. It starts with the word mount. Somebody? Mount Olympus. There you go, Mount Olympus. Mount Olympus is about 60 miles as a crow flies from Thessalonica. So perhaps on a clear day you can actually see it. I think it is about 9,000, a little over 9,000 feet in elevation. Who resided, according to the Greeks? Who lived in Mount Olympus? I'm going to start calling names if you don't volunteer. Who resided in Mount Olympus? Zeus. Zeus was the king of the gods. Okay? Hint, there's some names up here. So, Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Athena, Apollo, Ares, Aphrodite, so on and so forth. So the column on the left being the Greek, the column on the right being their counterparts to the Romans. So you're walking into this very, very much a culture of idolatry, right? And when we go back and look at Acts 17 for a few minutes, we're going to be reminded of that when Paul was in Athens. So we've got Jews. I guess we might call them traditional Jews that were living, or Orthodox Jews that were living in Thessalonica. But we have lots of Greek influence, of Greek deity, and we have Roman deity. So you can imagine a lot of pagan influence that has to be taught against. Well, when was the church in Thessalonica started? Anybody remember? I can be quiet for a long time. Anybody remember? Well, let's go back to Acts 17. Acts 17, 1 through 15. Now, when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica. Now, who are we talking about? They. Who do we know was in Thessalonica? Who's this they referring to? Paul, Silas, Timothy, right? Okay. And when they had passed through this area, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And what did Paul habitually always do when he entered a new city? Where was one of the first places he went? The synagogue, of course. As his custom was, he went to the synagogue, and for 3 Sabbaths, he reasoned with them from the Scriptures. We don't know how long Paul and Silas and Timothy spent on this first time in Thessalonica. This was, of course, on the second missionary journey. But it was at least 3 weeks, we know that. And so he explained and demonstrated that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, and saying, "This Jesus whom I preach to you is the Christ." And some of them were persuaded, and a great multitude of the devout Greeks, and not a few of the leading women joined Paul and Silas. But what happens, as we usually see? Are the Jews happy about this? Gwen shaking her head, no. But the Jews who were not persuaded becoming envious, and that's interesting use of the word there. What do we usually think of when we think that the Jews became angry about the teaching? Crucified Jesus. So part of it was kind of poking at the bear, so to speak. Part of it was maybe guilt on their part, maybe a little bit. Were they happy with what was being taught? No, they absolutely thought it was totally against Scripture as they knew it. And so they were usually angry to the point where they killed Christ. Here it says they were envious. So evidently Paul and Silas and Timothy were gaining some following, weren't they? Okay. The Jews who were not persuaded, becoming envious, took some of the evil men from the marketplace and, gathering a mob, set all the city in an uproar and attacked the house of Jason and sought to bring them out to the people. So, what role does Jason play here? And I believe Jason is a Greek name. Is he playing a role here? Pardon? Well, they've basically taken him hostage, right? When we have a visiting preacher, what happens commonly? Somebody takes them into their home, right? Right. So Jason was apparently their host. So they go to Jason's house. They drag him out. They were looking for Paul, Timothy, and Silas. But when they didn't find him, they dragged Jason out. And some of the rulers of the city crying out, "These who have turned the world upside down have come here." How have they turned the world upside down? When? They taught them something other than what they had been told their entire lives, right? Okay. Okay. That's a good observation. Those final couple of words. They've come here too. So they must have known they had been elsewhere teaching. Philippi was about 100 miles away, which is significant in that day when you're traveling mostly by foot, but word gets around. They didn't have internet, they didn't have television, cell phones, smartphones, but yeah, exactly. Yep, exactly. Okay, so the Jews follow their typical pattern here. Preaching is being done. Paul goes to the synagogue. He convinces some, and again, it's the usual pattern. It's the pattern of the gospel, isn't it? That some will hear it and obey, and some will reject it. So it says Jason had harbored them, and these are all acting contrary to the decrees of the Caesar, saying there is another king, Jesus. This is the same old refrain we've heard before, isn't it? And it's interesting. Did the Jews did they like being under Roman rule? No, of course not. And yet they're ready to invoke Caesar's name when it's convenient for them, aren't they? Oh, Caesar needs to know about this because they're saying there's another king. His name's Jesus. So they're quick to use Caesar's position. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. Yeah. Same old story. And and it may be exactly what you're saying, that they're trying to get out a counter message. It may be that they find themselves playing defense. You know, the Christian word is beginning to spread. People are beginning to be converted. They're starting to siphon people away from the traditional Jewish faith. And so we've got to go on the offense because right now we're on the defense. Thanks. Good point. And so they stir up this crowd, and they troubled the crowd and the rulers of the city when they heard these things. So when they had taken security from Jason and the rest, they let them go. Any ideas on what that means, they'd taken security from Jason? We have a modern day, maybe a corollary to that called bail. Apparently they had gotten some money, and they would release him. So then the brethren immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea. When they arrived, they went to the synagogue of the Jews. Paul just doesn't learn, does he? He is just hard-headed. He is determined. So the brethren say, you've got to leave. You're in danger here. They go to Berea. Berea is not that far away. It's just down the coast. Would be kind of, you go southwest of Thessalonica, that general direction. What do we know about the Bereans? Thessalonica, yes. Okay, that's exactly what verse 11 tells us. They were more noble, not in the sense of, we can use the word noble with respect to royalty, right? A nobleman. We're not talking about that. This, I use the New King James Version. I looked at different versions for the word noble. This translates it more fair-minded. Maybe the Bereans were more open-minded to the gospel. We know that they were searching the scripture daily. So they were very much involved in learning about this. And says, therefore, many of them believed, and also not a few of the Greeks, prominent women, as well as men. So, it's not the end of the story, though, of course. So what did the Jews do now? Yep. They doggedly follow Paul. They're not going to let him have any peace. They're not going to let him have freedom to preach as much as within their power. So the Jews from Thessalonica learned about where Paul was. He's in Berea. They go down there and they stir up the crowd. Then immediately the brethren sent Paul away again. So Paul is kind of on the run again. This time he's going to end up in Athens. So those who verse 14, they sent him away. Both Paul and Silas remained there, but they sent Paul to Athens, and receiving a command from Silas and Timothy to come to him with all speed, they departed. All right, so here we are in Acts chapter 17. Why are we here? We're studying Thessalonians. Well, for one reason, this is the establishment of the church in Thessalonica. It's going to tie in with Wednesday night's class. What happened before this? Where was Paul? What event happened? Anybody remember? There's a key event I think we view in the Bible. A key event before this, before he goes to Thessalonica, and after he's been to Thessalonica, and he's in Athens. Can anybody think of what that might be? Okay, all right. He was imprisoned in Philippi. Very well-known story to us, right? Very well-known Bible story. So he had left Philippi, and he had come with Silas and Timothy. They had then gone to Thessalonica. Now he's in Athens. What happens in Athens? Another well-known story to us of Athens and Paul. Rod. Correct. He preaches at the Areopagus. Going back to our slide on the Greek gods, I see that you're very superstitious and you have gods to everything, and that's not all the gods. That's like the major gods and goddesses, if I can put it that way, in the Greek culture. There were others. I imagine they had gods to about everything you can imagine, right? So, to kind of put this in historical context or sequence of events, coming from Philippi, where he'd been imprisoned, goes to Thessalonica, spends at least 3 weeks there, maybe more, gets run out of Thessalonica, goes to Berea, gets run out of Berea, goes to Athens, and speaks there at the Areopagus. Any idea of where he goes after Athens? Corinth, correct. And he's actually writing this letter from Corinth. These letters from Corinth. Okay, good. All right, any questions or comments? All right. So this kind of summarizes that. Traveled to Thessalonica, preached in the synagogue for 3 days, agitated Jews, they escape. So let me ask you this. Does Paul fleeing any of these cities indicate a lack of faith on his part? Gwen's shaking her head no. Anybody? What do you think? Does that indicate a lack of faith on Paul's part? Okay. All right. Cecilia says he's going on to somewhere else where others will believe, where his time and efforts will be more fruitful. He's planting seeds everywhere he goes, isn't he? Uh-huh. All right. Okay. Yes, ma'am. Okay. That's a really good point. That, let's remember that there were times when Jesus would disappear into the crowd, or kind of just disappear, right? And why was that? Why would that be? Why would that happen for Jesus? Was it his time yet at that point in time when those things happened? No. He had a bigger mission to fulfill, didn't he? So I didn't hear anybody say, "Yes, sir." Okay. All right. That's a good point. What's the expression? Discretion is the better part of valor. Absolutely. Who is guiding Paul through all these things? The Holy Spirit, right? We know that the Holy Spirit said, "No, don't go there. You need to go here," right? So I think we can agree. I'm sure we can agree. This is not a lack of faith on Paul's part. My goodness, you think about all that Paul went through: shipwrecks and beatings and imprisonment and all of the events of his life, which could be so discouraging. And that didn't happen with Paul. And so he's going to go where he can have more impact, but he's still spreading the word wherever he is. Can you imagine Paul going into the local Denny's, and I guess they didn't have Denny's. But when he leaves, he makes sure that whoever serves him has heard something about Jesus? Probably so, that wherever he went. And, I often think about a phrase a friend of ours would say: "Speak a word in behalf of your Lord this week." I think Paul did that on an everyday, almost every hour basis. Other comments or questions? Okay. So let's do a little bit of summary here on just kind of where we are. So this is Paul's second missionary journey. He's come from Philippi. Let me ask this question. I know it's a bit of supposition on our part, but I think it's safe to go there. If you look at Paul's second missionary journey, it kind of goes up around modern-day Turkey, and it ends up in Greece. And it tends to kind of hug the coastline, kind of. Why might that be important or significant? Any thoughts on that? Yeah, Kim, good point. Population base, right? What do they say, like in Australia, that 85% of the people live within 15 miles of the coast of Australia? Commerce, seaports, travel. Made travel easier. If he needed to travel by sea, which he did, it made that easier access. Right. Yeah, that we... And those are the cultures that we know of, because these were seaports. These were close to population centers. We don't know whether other cultures, through commerce, came through these areas. So I don't think it's by mistake. Well, I know it's not by mistake that his travels took him to these areas of really significance. Thessalonica, as we saw earlier, is a major city. Even today, it's a major city. By the way, in about 1430, the Ottoman Empire overtook Thessalonica. And one writer said that it was, how did they put it? It was shocking because it was the fall of Christendom in the area, meaning that Christianity had taken a big hold in Thessalonica between 51 AD and 1400. Now, Catholicism had come in and other things, but the teaching about Christ had grown tremendously to a city at that time of maybe 150,000 or more. Okay, there at least 3 weeks. By the way, most scholars regard this as being the first book of the New Testament to be put in writing, which I found interesting. I didn't know. Okay. Some versions use the name Sylvanus, and that would be like my father-in-law's name is Charles. We never have called him Charlie, but he could be called Charlie as a nickname or a shortened name, or Chuck. Both Paul and Silas were Romans, and so we know that they enjoyed some protection because they were traveling in Roman provinces and they were Romans. Paul doesn't really invoke his position as an apostle to be overbearing in this letter. You know, there are other letters where he'd say, I'm an apostle, and basically, because I'm an apostle, I have the authority to tell you this. He didn't really invoke his name or his position in this letter. And along the lines of paying respect to different cultures, both 1st and 2nd Thessalonians open with the greeting of grace and peace. Grace is a Greek salutation. When you think of grace, don't look at the slide. When you think of grace, how do you define grace in your mind? Okay, one definition is unmerited favor. Certainly is. Grace is a good thing, right? When I say grace to you, that means well for you, right? The favor of God and His related gifts. Peace is a Hebrew greeting. And so he is kind of paying homage to the prominent cultures there at the time when he writes this. And peace obviously implies tranquility and prosperity, both inward and outward peace. Okay? Pardon? Somebody? Okay. So I heard, I listened in on Jeff's lesson from last Sunday on our website. And I got nervous when he said, Perry's going to have some really cool stuff to share. And I don't know that you put Perry and cool in the same sentence. Maybe cool about what the Lord does and what God has done. But we will get into some interesting things. As he said, one of the things later will be their belief that their conception that Christ is coming soon. And so I can just take my ease and, this will all be over pretty soon. But Paul was clearly very concerned about the church in Thessalonica. I thought about it in this way. Corey and Prim and several men had just been out preaching in the hinterlands in India. And they baptized several people. Corey was there for maybe, in that village, maybe a day. So can you imagine that you've taught somebody the basics of the gospel, they've been baptized, and now you have to say, I got to go, right? Would you be concerned about their spiritual well-being and their ability to grow? I would think so. He'd been there, we'll say 3 weeks plus. He'd probably been teaching every day. But now he's got to leave. And he's got to leave these babes in Christ. And he's very concerned. He's concerned because the Jews don't like this. They're going to put pressure on them. The Greeks and the Romans are like, you all are crazy. Hey, we worship the gods in Mount Olympus. And so, very, very concerned about their well-being. And as we know, he has Timothy to go check on them and strengthen them a bit more. Bring me back a report. I need to know how they're doing. He had a deep love for the people here in Thessalonica. Comments? Questions? You all have got to quit talking so much. You leave no time for the material to be covered. It's just unacceptable. You're going to get tired of hearing me all the time. I know I have these dulcet tones, but... Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. That's an excellent point. Yeah, that's an excellent point because you're right. It does talk about how they sent him away. You know, you've got to go, Paul. This is not going to end well if you stay here. What obviously what they believe. So you need to go. But absolutely, we know that Paul would have withstood whatever. But there, as we would say in our vernacular, there were bigger fish to fry for Paul down the road, weren't there? And so he had a much bigger mission to fill. Okay, so next week, if you will do just some light reading, and you can read the whole book of 1 Thessalonians in 20 minutes or less. So next week we will be looking at the second chapter, verses 1 through 16. Okay? Thank you.